But today we're going to look at what pilots call the transition from steam power to glass. If you don't know those words, in just a few seconds you're going to learn all about them. I hope you enjoy part one, the transition from steam to glass. I've lived through one of the greatest changes in aviation history. For pilots of my era, we nicknamed that the change from steam power to glass. Steam power were the old flight instruments that most of us learning to fly during the 50s, 60s, and 70s grew up with. I can remember my first experience with steam power. It was in my dad's V-tailed V-35 Beechcraft Bonanza. He no longer had to listen to the audio code of a range signal to tell left and right on an airway. He had a needle, a CDI, that would tell him which way to steer. He had a big, what's called ADF, automatic direction finding unit. It was gear driven, weighed about 25 pounds. So at the time, he had a really top of the line aircraft. But his aircraft featured lots of round dials and knobs. That's what I thought every airplane looked like. And during flight training, as a student pilot and an instrument pilot, we learned if we had the quote T package, which meant we had an airspeed indicator, an attitude indicator, an altimeter, and right below the attitude indicator, a directional gyro, sort of a standardized package, we had the latest modern type instruments. I'd flown airplanes that didn't have a T package, like my dad's Bonanza. Wow, it was crazy. You had to look, and every airplane was different. When we got to the T package, your instrument scan was the same each time. But there were no computers, no cell phone, no internet, and certainly no FMS or flight management system on board these type aircraft. My first real airliner was a Convair 580, like the one you see in the picture. The picture you see is of a modernized Convair 580. Ours were not that nice. I definitely remember the co-pilot or the first officer only had a CDI, a course deviation indicator, and no HSI. The captain, however, did have an HSI, and we regularly flew into Wichita Falls, Texas, which had a back course approach. So the captain would always make the co-pilot or the first officer fly that approach. To see if he remembered, he had to turn in the opposite direction of his needle. The captain's HSI corrected for this problem, but not the co-pilot's CDI. It had reverse sensing. This seems like the Stone Age, but this was everyday operations fairly recently. This was during the 1980s. When I left the Convair, I transitioned to the Boeing 727, commonly referred to as the three-holer. Really, the only difference was there were just more knobs and more dials, but no computer. We didn't even have the most simple thing. To get the ground speed, we had to look at this archaic DME readout that was kind of like a little rolling wheel, use our stopwatch, and manually compute our ground speed. The flight engineer, or the third pilot, was essentially our computer. All calculations were done by hand on a display the flight engineer called the tabletop, or out of one of the performance manuals. I flew for a while as flight engineer on the 727 before upgrading to co-pilot and eventually captain. I can tell you personally, that flight engineer was a completely busy guy because he was just a human computer. My next stop, which would be my final stop in the world of steam-powered airplanes, would be on the classic 7.4, the 7.4 100, 200, and 300. When I finally reached that point of the super steam power, on that airplane, there was an INS, an inertial navigation system, which seemed extremely cool. It allowed us to fly direct to a total of 9 different points anywhere in the world. At the time, it seemed very fancy, but there were lots and lots more knobs and gauges than the 727. I remember vividly the first time I went in the cockpit on the 747, the simulator. I looked at this, what looked like 80 feet long. I don't know, it's about 9 feet long, flight engineer panel. And I was just going, oh my goodness, thinking in my head, I'm glad I'm not the flight engineer. The very kind simulator instructor, Charlie, who was a retired 747 captain with Braniff, looked at me and said, look, James, you're now a captain. Somebody else is going to take care of all those knobs and dials for you. This was the pinnacle of steam power for me. Well, finally, in 1991, I got my chance to transition from the steam-powered 747 to the new all-glass 747-400. Even though I'd been flying professionally for 14 years, I'd been a captain on both the 727 and 747. The whole thing was totally overwhelming in transitioning to this new glass cockpit. I quickly realized that all the instrument flying and navigational skills I learned from the old round knobs and dials or the T configuration of basic flight instruments would have to be significantly altered to compensate for all these new television screens and keyboards. First of all my instrument scan was totally worthless. Now, instead of the T configuration, I'd look at what they told me was a PFD, a primary flight display, which was all the instruments times seemingly 10 in the amount of information displayed on a CRT. It was overwhelming. I didn't even know when I got in the simulator what I should look at, and it took quite a while to relearn that. Fortunately, we all received lots of simulator training because no one had this new skill down pat. Second of all, the navigation was like nothing else we had ever seen before. Before, we were used to tuning up radio on a frequency for a VOR, centering the needles and following them. Now we had a keyboard and a quote scratch pad where via this what's called FMS, the flight management system, we'd type our flight plan in, the altitudes, the speeds, the performance, everything into this computer. The flight engineer was gone. He'd been replaced by a computer. And to make matters even more challenging, if one pilot changed something in FMS without telling the other pilot, it could be life-threatening. Hi, my name is James Weatherly. Welcome to this continuing series about computers flying airplanes. It comes from a book I've written called Rules of Glass. In this series, we're going to look at crew rules. How do the two human beings work together and interface with the computer? Watch and you'll find this extremely interesting in how we work together as a crew working with the computer. Enjoy these 9 rules next. Now, rule 1, someone has to fly the airplane. This probably seems so obvious to anyone who's never flown a highly automated glass cockpit that it might seem ridiculous. In the old days, there was no autopilot. You had to fly the airplane, and it was obvious. If you let go of the controls and the airplane was the least bit out of trim, you'd go way off, left, right, up, down. But now in these completely automated airplanes, the biggest danger is for the PF, that's an abbreviation for pilot flying, to become the PNF, pilot not flying. That basically has how we sort out the duty. One pilot flies, one works the radio and the navigation system. But there has to be someone flying the airplane. You can be completely lulled asleep. These airplanes literally fly themselves. 747 could make a complete automatic landing. And the factor that happens for the pilot is it actually works against them. This factor that the airplane kind of does everything, believe it or not, you can quickly disconnect and forget to fly the airplane. A person flying the airplane and being engaged is defined as these things. 1, the pilot knows the proper mode of auto flight that he's in. He's got to know what the autopilot's doing, and that's appropriate for the moment. It can be as simple as this. Somebody gives you a heading and then says, now cleared direct to Jacksonville, and you forget to engage the nav button and go to LNAV. That means you're not paying attention. Easy to do. Everybody's done it multiple times. Also, the pilot flying must make sure he's complying with the air traffic control clearance. It's easy to forget to climb, forget to report something. That's the duty of the pilot flying, to make sure that the airplane is complying with the clearance from air traffic control. Real important is the pilot flying cannot allow the airplane to be involved in a CFIT. CFIT, C-F-I-T, controlled flight into terrain. It's possible for the autopilot to fly the airplane into the ground and kill everybody on board. We'll talk about an accident here in just a moment that happened many years ago due to automation. Also, the pilot flying needs to make sure to look around for other traffic, see if there's anybody too close to him. We do have TCAS, a lot of other systems, but he's got to remember, look around. Next, the pilot flying has to fly the airplane and make sure you're in the proper airspeed and configuration. With auto throttles and autopilots, it's easy to get a little distracted, forget to put the flaps out, the leading edge devices, whatever your airplane is, and all of a sudden you're flying either too slow or too fast for the configuration. And lastly, the pilot needs to maintain overall situational awareness. He needs to know where he is. You have all these awesome maps and everything, but you got to know inside your head, where are you? If everything quits, where am I? What do I need to do? Can everything quit at once? Absolutely. Very recently on a flight, we're coming from the West Coast back to South Florida. The weather's horrible. We're approaching our minimum fuel to divert. We've already told the controller we're planning on potentially diverting. He tells us now we've got a hold, so we say, hey, we can make 2 laps in the hold, then we're going elsewhere for fuel. We enter the hole, make a right turn to the outbound leg, and boom! Series of events happen. Both the autopilot and flight director are offline, unrecoverable, and we have to revert back to total, absolute hand flying. Hey, it can happen at any time. Not something we normally have to do, but you better be ready. This equipment is possible to fail. Until a few years ago, this would have made no sense at all to the general public, that a pilot could be lured away from flying the airplane by this automation. But now it's easy to understand. How many people do you see going down the road playing on their cell phone and not watching what they're doing? There's some huge percentage of accidents that are related to electronics. Same thing can happen to a pilot, easily distracted. It could be as simple as the pilot flying just saying, hey, just a second, I need to look this up on my iPad, because a lot of our navigational stuff is in the iPad. Or he can get down there and start punching away on the FMS. At that point in time, the pilot flying becomes a passenger. There is no pilot flying because his attention is subtly distracted. And the possibility of a catastrophe goes exponentially up because nobody's flying the airplane. Even before total automation of the glass era, there was a horrific crash in 1972 that exemplified how easy it is for the pilot to forget to fly the airplane. Before even the era of completely automated glass airplanes, there was a horrific accident in 1972 by a Lockheed L-1011 operated by Eastern Airlines. It was inbound to Miami during a time when there was action by the Air Traffic Controller Union, and they were kind of short-staffed. Supervisors were manning the radar. They came into Miami, and then when they put the landing gear down, they could not get the green down and lock light for the nose gear. Well, they went around, and during the go-around, the captain instructed the first officer, who was the pilot flying, to engage the autopilot. As soon as they got level out at 2,000 feet, they started analyzing the problem. The flight engineer, third pilot, went down and started looking in the E&E compartment, which is down underneath the flight deck, to see if he could look through a little visual indicator hole, see if the nose gear was down and locked. While he left the flight deck, both the captain, who was the pilot flying, and the first officer started trying to get the bulbs out of the nose wheel green light. No one was flying the airplane. And when the captain moved, he accidentally bumped the control wheel. And when you do that, it in that airplane triggered in the control wheel steering, meaning that the airplane is not going to go to a specific altitude, but actually started a minor descent. The crew never noticed that. And since the air traffic controllers were overloaded and they didn't call low altitude that time, he saw the airplane descending, but he wasn't sure what was going on. He just asked him, "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, we're working on the problem." He gives them a turn, and literally 3 seconds before they hit the ground, the co-pilot looks up and said, "Aren't we at 2,000 feet? 1,000, 2, 1,000. Boom. The airplane under autopilot flew itself into the ground. A horrific tragedy because the pilot flying got distracted and did not monitor the automation. Rule number 2. It might sound on the surface the same as rule number 1, but it's completely different. Remember, rule number 1 says simply, you got to fly the airplane. Somebody has to do it. That's the assigned duty of the pilot flying. Rule number 2 says, never have two heads down. Heads down means looking down, punching something, doing something. But it's a serious problem if both pilots are heads down punching something. That's what happened in that Eastern Airlines crash. Both pilots went heads down looking at the landing gear problem. In these computerized airplanes, the glass airplanes, it's so easy to do. We got minimum two, sometimes 3 or more keyboards in front of us, and one person can start punching, and he's the PNF, the pilot not flying, and start asking the pilot flying, "Hey, what's going on?" And before you know it, both of them are down there punching. "Well, I don't know, this page, I'll do this." And it's like a vacuum, a whirlpool, just sucks your brain right down in there. It's very easy to do. You have to guard against having two heads down during flight. It can happen during looking at maps, it can happen looking at iPads, it can happen particularly programming in the FMS or looking at the charts that are displayed in the airplane. What I do and suggest is whenever you're going to be, if you're the pilot not flying, advise the pilot flying, "Hey, I'm heads down, I'm working on this." Sometimes, like when we clear the runway and then we've got to do the after landing checklist, you're oftentimes completely heads down, not watching a critical phase of flight. So one pilot will tell the other, "Hey, look, just while I get this after landing, I'm heads down." Now, if you're the pilot flying and you need to look at something and really devote your full attention, I'm not talking about 2 seconds looking down, but when you're looking at something, you need to say, "Okay, your controls, I'm going heads down. I've got to work this out in the box, or I've got to see what's going on here." It's important that you communicate and protect yourself from two heads down at the same time. Obviously, if you violate this rule, you violated rule number 1. With two pilots, if both of them are heads down, by definition, nobody's flying the airplane. Next rule, we'll look at rule number 3. Let's talk about rule number 3 now. Now, before I even tell you this rule, you're going to think I'm not even paying attention, and I think you're not paying attention, but that's not right. If you ever played sports like football, the coach seems to repeat every day at practice the same thing, like how to make a tackle. It's so basic, you've heard it 100 times, but if you mess up, it screws up the whole game. If you've had little kids, how many times have you repeated things? This is one of those sounds like a repeating thing, and I'll tell you why. But rule number 3 is simple. When the pilot programs the FMS, he is not flying the airplane. Again, when the pilot flying programs, he's not flying. I have, I'm not sure, several thousands of hours as a simulator instructor. Thousands. Several years I worked as a simulator instructor on airliners and corporate jets. The one thing that I've seen over and over is where the pilot flying starts hammering away, and then it results in a horrific loss of control because he quits flying the airplane, screws something up, and wham, blap. We have to start all over again. That's, what are you doing? I don't know. A lot of times I just no, you can't program and fly. It doesn't work. So keep this in your mind. If you start programming the computer, you're obviously not flying. That's the reason there's 2 pilots. There's a pilot not flying. He's the one that should do the massive amount of the programming in flight. If you're above 10,000 feet and you want to program something, I understand. Just transfer controls, have the other pilot say, hey, I know something on this arrival, I want to set it all in your controls, and then I'll punch it in. Once you get it, tell them what you've done, and now transfer controls back. It's that simple. And it is so easy. You're looking at, I could just punch this real quick, I want to wait on the other guy, but no. Let the other guy punch when you're flying, and things will work out much better. As a side note, you don't have this in airliners, but in corporate jets, on smaller ones, they have what are called single pilot exemption. And some poor guy is flying, operating the radio, and programming without the aid of a second pilot. Wow, my hats are off to you. But if you are one of those guys in that very challenging environment, you have to be super careful. Make sure the autopilot's on, everything's under control, because when you take your eyes off the airplane while you're doing this, you're relying 100% on the autopilot. So you have to tune your ear whenever you disconnect, so you're thinking about that at all times. Hi, my name is James Weatherly. Welcome to this continuing series about computers flying airplanes. It comes from a book I've written called Rules of Glass. In this series, we're going to look at crew rules. How do the 2 human beings work together and interface with the computer? Watch and you'll find this extremely interesting in how we work together as a crew working with the computer. Now let's talk about rule number 4. Never execute without confirming first. Now, this has changed a little bit since I first wrote the book called The Rules of Glass about flying computerized airplane. At that time, every FMS pretty much in the airliners had an execute button. And before you modified anything, the light would come on, or excuse me, after you've modified something in the route anywhere in the FMS, the light would come on and you hit the execute button, kind of like the save button or the enter button on a computer. But once you did that, it was very hard to go back. So you were taught, and there's excellent instruction from Boeing, when you're ready to execute something, always check with the other pilot. Never, ever execute without checking with the other pilot. Now, what has changed with this is that some units now don't even have an execute button. When you hit it, it's done. That's even more dangerous, because what happens, there's a couple of problems here. First, whenever you modify something in flight, you want to make sure your buddy that you're flying with knows what's happening. There's nothing worse than being off frequency, talking to the company, talking to the FBO, getting weather, come back on, and then you look down there, where the heck are we going? Well, the other pilot executed something and then forgot to tell you about it. Your situational awareness is degraded significantly. Or they've changed the approach. He put it in there, forgot to tell you. So whenever you have to modify a route, always check with the other pilot before you press the execute button. Currently, I fly a Honeywell unit that doesn't have an execute button. And what we do when we're like, okay, now clear direct JFK, we hit the direct button and then it comes up the page where we're going to select JFK. We put our finger over there and ask the other guy, hey, that look good to you? Direct JFK. And then we always confirm once we press that on our PFD that it's displaying going to JFK and that we're in LNAV. So it's kind of three parts to this rule. First, don't execute by whatever system you've got. You're flying Garmin. It doesn't have an execute. I forget, load and activate or something is the word there. Honeywell no longer in some of the corporate ones. In the FMZ or whatever number it is, has the kind like I'm used to. Then in the Rockwell Collins or the airliners, you have the execute button. But the first thing, no matter what you do, when you modify, check with the other guy, get a confirmation. Make sure you don't screw up and kind of helps you. Second thing, once you have executed or modified by whatever thing, look at your navigational instrument, make sure it's really going to that point. Thirdly, make sure if you're going to that point, you're in LNAV. Oh my goodness, could I tell you some stories about going in crew rest, waking up and seeing us way off track because we were in heading select, deviating around some weather while I'm asleep, wake up and the crew forgot to go back direct to the point. We're in non-radar. I said, call them immediately, give them an update because we're 3 minutes past our time. It happens. So those three things, check with the other guy before you modify and make sure you've got confirmation before executing or modifying. Second thing, verify that you are going to that point. And thirdly, that you're navigating to it in LNAV. You're not still in heading, select, roll, or any other one. Okay, now we'll move on to Rule 5. Okay, now let's talk about something pretty simple. Rule 5. Make sure both pilots pre-flight the FMS before you take off. This is real simple. It's not a problem of, oh my, make sure I don't do something in flight. The airplane's not even moving. But once one pilot has put the flight plan in, the other pilot needs to cross-check. He needs to verify that we're at the correct initial position. Remember, if you don't get the position loaded, this thing will tell you you are in New York when you're really in London. I mean, it doesn't know, so you got to verify the position is correct. Second thing, you got the current database that you're flying off correct information. Thirdly, that the routing in the FMS agrees with your clearance. Now, in the unit I fly, we get a direct data link download of the flight plan, which is really cool. It'll put the flight plan, the winds, everything in there. But one thing is, it puts the filed flight plan, not necessarily the cleared flight plan. So you've got to check that very carefully. Next, make sure that the performance is correct. You won't be taken off with the wrong flap setting the wrong runway. Garbage in, garbage out. You have to do a complete pre-flight. So take your time and make sure to go through each one of these steps. It should be on your checklist. Then, once you've pre-flighted it, you're ready to go. Now, we'll move on to the next one, rule number 6 in the crew rules. Now for rule 6, hope I can hold up 6 fingers. This is a simple rule. Don't type below 10,000 feet. That's a real basic rule. First of all, if you're flying under commercial operations like an airline, there's a lot of rules about sterile cockpit below 10,000 feet. I highly suggest you limit the amount of programming below 10,000 feet. Sometimes, yeah, you're on vectors. He says, no, switch over to runway 31 right when you were planning ILS 31 left. Yeah, you've got to change the box. But don't make it a habit programming the box below 10,000 feet. Just wait. Try to get it done in advance. And if it's something that you can wait on, just wait. There's too many distractions below 10,000 feet. Lots of stuff, talk. Lots of approach charts, lots of stuff going on. So just avoid typing below 10,000 feet. Now, let's take a look at the next rule, which will be rule number 7. Okay, rule number 7. This is another simple rule. Work one at a time on your approach preparation. What I mean by that, when you are listening to your ATIS or getting your weather by your data link, your D-ATIS, however you get the weather, when you find out what approach you're going to be doing, have one pilot program that, get everything going while the other pilot flies, then switch off. The pilot who's flying can look and study that. Then you're ready for the pilot flying, take back over the controls and have a briefing. It's real simple. I do this every day. The pilot not flying will program everything, make sure it's all in order, get everything loaded, call out the minimums, get the approach chart selected if you're on an aircraft with approach charts as part of its system. The other guy will take a look at it while the pilot not flying takes over controls. Then one guy will brief it. In our situation, we have the pilot not flying brief the approach. That's so that there'll be no distractions for the pilot flying, and then he asks the pilot not flying whatever questions he has. Whatever situation your operations and your standard operating procedures dictate, that's fine. But don't have both guys working on the approach at the same time. That's not safe, doesn't work, and each person gets about half the information they need at a time. So do it one at a time, then study it, independently brief it together, you'll be good to go. Next, we go on to rule number 8. Almost there. Rule number 8. Make maximum use of the auto flight system. Well, there's a lot of discussion because, you know, when you're flying on automatic systems where you have autopilot, auto throttle, everything, your flying skills are not at the top of its game. When I was on the Convair 580, it wasn't a problem. There was no autopilot. There was no flight director. And the co-pilot, we didn't even have an HSI, so you were steering. When I moved to the 7.2, we did have an autopilot and some crude auto throttles, but it was only so-so. Now, as the airplanes got more and more sophisticated, by the time I got to 747-400, they wanted you to fly automatic. And today, it's best to use the maximum use of the auto flight. If you want to work on your hand flying skills, don't pick an airport like, let's depart Teterboro and try to hand fly it. You're going to blow through that 1,500-foot altitude restriction on departure, so you don't midair with somebody in Newark and everybody's going to be freaking out. Pick a nice airport like in the middle of nowhere. We go to Waco, Texas every once in a while. There's not a whole lot happening out there. That's a good time to hand fly. When you're going to hand fly a bunch, pick airports that are not super busy. Otherwise, as soon as you have time, like on takeoff, engage your autopilot so you can look around, be involved looking at traffic, listen to controllers, and keeping in sync. That's one of the keys to the glass cockpit. Maximize the use of that. Don't minimize. Pick the times when you want to hand fly. There are plenty of times. We go into Aspen, Colorado. That's certainly going to be a hand-flown approach. There is absolutely no doubt about it. So you have to keep your hand-flying skills. But keeping on automation brings essentially a third pilot into play. The autopilot is now monitoring and flying and keeping up with those things, particularly if you've got auto throttles, so that you can concentrate, monitor that. Then if the other guy has to be off frequency or something, you've got something going for you. So make maximum use of your auto flight system. Next, and we're just about there. Let's see if I can get that many fingers up. 9, rule 9 coming up. Okay, we're finally at the end, the last of the crew rules, rule number 9. And this doesn't just apply to old guys like me. Simply slow down and take your time. Oh man, I have been in the cockpit with people that have, younger guys particularly, always flying glass, but sometimes it's not age dependent. Man, they get in there, I'm ready. They go so fast, I have no clue what they've just done. And I'm not exactly an inexperienced guy, but if you go so fast, nobody can keep up with it. You also tend to make mistakes. In the glass cockpit in particular, these computerized airplanes that kind of fly themselves, slow down, take your time, verify each thing. Make sure that each of you, your buddy over there, he knows what you're doing. Slow down your pace. The computers will run fast enough, but if you try to run at that same speed, you're invariably going to make a mistake. And even worse, it's going to be very hard for the other human being or human beings, if you're flying on multi-crewed, long-range aircraft, they can't keep up with what you're doing. So simply slow down and enjoy the pace. Thanks for joining me on this part 2 of the rules of glass. Next, part 3 will take us in a whole separate rules that deal with the boxes and how the technical operation of things should go. Thank you. And I'd like to say thank you to 2 groups of people. One were the initial instructors at Boeing in Seattle, Washington, that trained all of us on what we needed to do when we transitioned to glass airplanes. We were reinforced by specially trained pilots at KLM who were transitioning the whole fleet from steam power to glass. What amazes me is that all the things that they taught us were timeless. Hi, thanks for joining us in this last of the series, Computers Flying the Airplane, or Rules of Glass. In this section, you're going to hear 9 super critical tips. I call them tips to self-preservation or tips for staying alive. Tune right in. If you like what you see, hit the subscribe button on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Here we go. Tip number 1 to the how to survive, how to preserve yourself is fairly simple. All these tips involve how we interface with the fully automated airplane. The first one is, if you have a complex procedure, use the plan mode or whatever you call your north up mode to make sure that your route is sequenced correctly. If you're only doing short flights from A to B and vectors to an ILS, this seems kind of strange, but I'm going to tell you, you're going to find SIDs, stars, and approaches that are so complicated it seems like the airplane's flying around this. You look down at your legs page and you try to sort it all out with the approach plate or whatever, and you can be totally confused. What I find the easiest thing to do is have your legs page showing your flight plan of your waypoints, and at the same time over on your MFD or your ND, have the plan mode. Plan mode is a mode where it displays north up, so it looks exactly like you're looking at a map or an approach plate. And that way you can follow right along and you'll quickly detect any errors, such as somewhere the airplane is reversing course. That happens all the time during these complex procedures. Use this plan mode and you'll eliminate a great deal of those problems. Because using that, you're looking at your CDU where you've got the legs, you're looking at an approach plate, and you're looking at something visual on your ND or your MFD. Now the second thing in our tips today. This is another simple one, but it's a real guide to survival. Don't ignore FMS messages. I can remember when these things first came out, they'd pop up all sorts of messages and people just learned to hit the clear button and ignore them. No, 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 no. Such as, for example, you're going along, you've put your flight plan in and it says, inadequate fuel. That probably means you've punched something wrong in your route. Or if you're en route, you're encountering unbelievable headwinds. But whenever you see a message, whatever it is, and I'm going to tell you, you have to have there, and I use my iPad, and I use the iBooks feature with all the FMS manuals on board, because sometimes you'll see crazy things. You don't even know what it is, neither does the other pilot. If you have any doubt, stop and look up that message. What I've found now with the new units, these FMS messages are warning you about a potential problem. We recently had a problem where it was warning us about an LPV approach and a coding problem. Wasn't even something we could do. So whenever you get an FMS message, stop, look at it, have both pilots agree before you clear it. If you don't know what it is, take the time and look it up in your book. I think you'll find now, when you get that message, it's something important. Okay, now, number 3 in self-preservation tips. Make sure both pilots are on the correct page on your FMS, your CDU, your MCDU, whatever you call it, your computer screen on your FMS. Make sure you're on the correct page. I can walk in a cockpit and sit and look there and see if these guys are in the picture or not. When I do something like one guy in cruise flight is on radio page, the other guy's on perf-a-nit, man, there's something pretty strange there. Or one guy's on position or something. That's not a page you want to be on in flight. In cruise flight, normally you've got one guy on radio page and one guy on the legs page, or maybe you have one guy in vertical navigation, one in lateral navigation. Whatever it is, make sure that the information that you have displayed is correct for your phase of flight. It shows that you are in sync with the machine, you know what it's doing, and you're prepared for the next item to come. Now let's go to point 4 in this series of tips. This one is super critical. Know what mode you're in. By that I mean you've got a flight mode annunciator up there. You've got to read it and see if you have auto throttles. What is your auto throttle doing? What is your lateral navigation? What is your vertical navigation? What is the status of the autopilot? And remember, each time you select a button to change something in your auto flight system, that's just a selection. You have to confirm that with whatever type of flight mode annunciator you have on your PFD. So if you press nav, you should call out, hey, okay, now I see LNAV engage. Whenever we're doing something and we'll go somewhere, we always say, if we're in heading select and he says go direct, we turn the airplane, we confirm in the FMS that we have selected direct. We look up on the PFD, we see if it's there, and then when we press nav, we look and see if we are actually enunciating LNAV. Many airlines and corporations have it in their standard operating procedures, their SOPs, to call out or to announce when the FMA changes, such as VNAV, VFelch, LNAV, approach, localizer, whatever it is. Calling those out so that both pilots know what is going on is critical. Missing this step is life-threatening, because you may think you're doing something and the airplane is doing something totally else. It could be your own error, or it could be you press the button and it just didn't engage. I flew a system for a while and it habitually, you would press the button but it wouldn't engage. Number 5 in the tips to keep you alive and self-preservation. If you've ever had this happen in the simulator, this is very shocking. If you ever have this in the real world, it'll kind of blow your mind. Well, I don't know about you guys and all the people watching, but my experience is you don't actually execute a go-around. That means where you're coming in for a landing, and at the last moment, you either don't see the runway or somebody pulls out in front of you and you have to add power, retract flaps, gears, and climb out on a predetermined procedure called the missed approach procedure. Now, in all the automated airplanes, once they get locked in for landing, they're pretty much going to take you down to a point where you're going to see the runway or go around. Now, during this procedure, you must set the missed approach altitude in your altitude selector. Now, that seems simple enough, but let me give you a simple thing. Let's say you're going on a localizer approach. This is where you descend to a certain altitude. It's called a non-precision approach, maybe 500 feet above the ground. You see the airport. You've got the altitude selector at, let's say, 600 feet, because that's the MDA for this approach. You start on down, and the airport, say, 100-foot elevation, and all of a sudden, an airplane pulls out in front of you, and the controller says, go around, execute standard missed approach. So you add power, you pull the nose back, you go flaps, whatever, 15, positive rate gear up, and then you select lateral navigation, vertical navigation. Next thing you know, boom, you get to 600 feet and the airplane's leveling out. Whoa, what's happening? That's because you forgot to set the missed approach altitude, because it will honor that missed approach altitude on the way back up. If you have too low a one set, you're going to be in a big problem. I have seen this happen in the simulator, and I've seen it almost happen in the real world. So make sure you have the proper missed approach altitude set. Okay, let's look at tip number 6 for staying alive, the self-preservation tips. This one's simple. All problems have the same answer. Once again, all problems have the same answer. What do I mean by that? Whenever you encounter any type of problem, there's a simple sequence of events. The first thing that has to happen is the pilot flying must fly the airplane. As simple as it sounds, you can get distracted. Someone has to fly the airplane. That's maneuvering the airplane, keep it from hitting the ground and on the assigned track. The second thing is put the autopilot on. Do not attempt in an emergency to fly the airplane unless you're one where it's out of control and the autopilot won't work. So put the autopilot on. That brings essentially a third pilot into the equation. The next step, call for the appropriate emergency checklist. With all these CAS equipped computer alerting systems where the problem displays right in front of you, you just read the problem and call for the checklist. The non-flying pilot will pick up the checklist, find the matching one, and begin. And lastly, announce to the non-flying pilot, I'll handle the radios. How simple it is. All problems have the same answer. First, fly the airplane. Second, get the airplane on autopilot. Number 3, call for the appropriate checklist using the ICAS system. The non-flying pilot will accomplish that. And number 3, the flying pilot should work the radios. How simple is that? Okay, we're 2/3 of the way through. Okay, now for tip number 7. The map display is not real. What? All this computer stuff? It has to be right. No. Listen, the map display is not real. What do I mean by that? The map display that you look at is a computer-generated display. If it gets the wrong information, it will display the wrong things. Probably in another video, I'll tell you about a story for an airline I flew with and had a major problem where we had map shift. Map shift, what's that? That's where you're flying along and the map has shifted slowly from what reality is. We don't hear about that much anymore, but it's a definite possibility. You have to remember that the map is generated by a computer system. First of all, you put the position in. Then once you take off, it's updated by a series of items. Nowadays, which is wonderful, we have the global positioning system. And through the satellites, normally we have a high accuracy updating the map because over time, the laser gyros, whatever system you have driving it, will drift. So it has to be updated. The first update is from the satellite system. The second update is a series of DME updates, where it takes 2 to up to some systems 6 DME stations, compares them, and updates your position. The last type of update is VOR DME, where it just takes a radial and DME and updates that to improve the map's position. And the sequence: satellite the best, DME, DME second best, VOR DME not so good. And if you lose all of those, you'll fall into what's called DR, or dead reckoning. That be bad, folks. DR is not good. That means your map is no longer updating, so over time, the real position of the map will drift. Now, if you're in DR for 3 minutes, that doesn't really matter. But if you are for an extended period of time, or you're operating below your MORA, your minimum off-route altitude, or your MSA, you should climb immediately if you have dead reckoning, or get established on a known radio route, like a VOR airway or a VOR transition. All sounds kind of crazy, but can it happen? Let me give you a simple way this can happen. First of all, the pilot takes off and he manually tunes the VORs for procedure. So they're automatically inhibited from VOR, DME, DME update, or VOR DME. So he just forgets to take and put the system back in auto tune. Then he's flying over an area. This can happen sometimes in the western part of the United States and other parts of the world where there's a known area that GPS is not receiving. So the system tries to update the map after a fairly long flight with the GPS. Boom, that's not there. So it's a smart system. It reverts to DME, DME. But the station you've tuned is 1,000 miles behind you. Then it says, okay, that's no problem. I'll look for VOR DME. Well, it's locked also. Then all of a sudden you fall into dead reckoning. And now, if you're in a mountainous area descending, your map may not be certain. So always make sure you have the proper updating going. You're in automatic so it can update. And if there's any doubt, establish yourself on a known radio route. Okay, number 8 in the survival tips. Always make sure for your waypoints that it has the correct latitude and longitude. Okay, where this can happen, let's say you go to VOR ABC and you type that in, your FMS, and then all of a sudden it pops up this page where it gives you 2 choices or 3 choices of the ABC VOR. Now the system's designed to carefully select the one closest to you. I have personally seen an error made before in the system, but you should look if there's 2 waypoints with the same name, or 3, you want to select it. That's by the latitude and longitude. If you have any doubt, you look it up on the chart and check that. Very important. Also, one way you can check that when you're putting your flight plan in to make sure that the waypoints are correct, even though you've got the current database, you look at the mileage between each one and the total mileage of the flight plan. If it's more than just a few miles off, there's an error. And you'll usually see it. You're going here, okay, that's 123 apart, that's 204, that's 5,926. Okay, there's nothing with 5,926. I've got the wrong identifier, or it's picked the wrong waypoint. And you can also check that on your progress page where it's the total mileage. Always look at those to verify that you have the correct waypoints in there. It's a computer and people can make mistakes. Last in the tips for survival, just don't forget, you can always use the real glass. What's the real glass? That's that windshield right in front of you. You look out. If something goes wrong with your system, everything goes southbound, don't get so suctioned in to the computers punching and try to resolve it. Look outside and fly the airplane. The other guy can work on it. If both of you can just look outside, make basic flying, get the airplane under control. Never let the computers and the automation take so much control that you as the pilot are no longer necessary. You're the fail-safe. When that thing goes the wrong way, does something crazy, you just look out that window, revert back to basic flying, whether you're in military, civilian, however you learn to fly. At some point, you learn to fly by visual reference. That's what I would suggest to do.